Okay, guys, welcome back to another online lecture. Today's topic is going to be the Cold War, and as you can see from our slide here, the Cold War is a long-lasting event, right? About 45 years it took for us to start the Cold War to finish the Cold War, and there's a bunch of different stuff that happens in between those times. Some stuff domestic, like the JFK assassination, and then some stuff abroad, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Crisis. A lot of stuff takes place during the Cold War, and because of that, we're going to be splitting it up into 2 weeks. Okay, so according to my list here, we're going to do the Cold War for week 3, and we're going to do the Cold War for week 4, because there's so many stuff, or so much information that we have to kind of split it up. So this is week 3, and this would be kind of the beginning stages of the Cold War and some of the initial events. And then next week, week 4, we'll spend time looking at the rest. So let's just kind of dive into it here. As you can see, the Cold War, the United States versus the newly formed Soviet Union. Okay, maybe a more powerful Soviet Union now than it was in like 1907, 1915. So we have the U.S. versus the Union of the Soviet Republics, democracy versus communism, capitalism versus socialism. All these things are at play. You know, Rocky versus Ivan Dravic. Okay, we have a lot of things at play. Now, when we get into it here, that's the right one. There we go. So there's 5 basically key elements of the Cold War. And here's the 5 right here, if I can stop messing up. Number 1 is espionage. Espionage basically just is a fancy word for spies. Okay, so obviously we had spies in the Kremlin or in Moscow, and they had spies in Washington, D.C. So we'll talk about the spy game a little bit later. Foreign aid becomes really important at the beginning stages of it, and we'll talk about that. The alliance system, propaganda, and a thing called a proxy war. A proxy war, guys, is a fancy word for one example of a proxy war would be Vietnam War, where the United States and the Soviet Union are not fighting each other, but we kind of have different pieces fighting for us. In Vietnam, for example, we are doing the fighting for the Americans, so we're actually fighting ourselves, but we're fighting the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, and they're being backed by the Soviet Union. So we're not fighting directly, but we're kind of fighting with them because of the people they represent. And there's other cases of that happening where Russia's fighting and they're fighting someone else, but we're backing that other country. So a proxy war is we're kind of at war with each other, but at the same time we're not. So it's kind of a little passive-aggressive war, as we may say. So let's move forward to the goals of the United States during kind of the Cold War period and post-World War II. Okay. First things first, we wanted to promote an open market for U.S. goods to prevent another depression. Basically, we wanted a lot of people to switch their economic system to more of a capitalistic look. And selfishly, it was because we could sell more goods. Okay, remember now in post-World War II, the United States war machine is up and running. Our factories are pumping out goods left and right. And if we want to make a ton of money, we need to make sure that other countries are capitalists as well so that they can buy our goods. Okay? And that's different than what socialism would look like, what the Soviet Union wants, as they basically do not want open markets. They want the government to be in control of their economic system. That would basically make less people want to buy. The United States loses money. So we don't want that. Obviously, point 2 then is we want to promote democracy throughout the world, especially in Asia and Africa, okay, places that didn't typically have democracy going into World War II. And because of this, we're going to fight a couple of proxy wars in Asia. We're going to fight the Korean War, and then we're going to fight the Vietnam War, okay? And the whole idea of fighting these wars, guys, was to hopefully stop the spread of communism, okay? It's called the domino effect. And it's kind of, for example, if we think about the domino effect and if we think about the states of the United States, here's how it would look. If Wisconsin became communism, the fear would be that that's the first domino to fall. And when it falls and lands, it's going to hit Minnesota. And then Minnesota's going to turn communism. And then that domino is going to fall. And then Iowa. And then South Dakota. Then North Dakota. Okay? So that's the domino effect. But instead of states, it was actually countries. So, for example, it would be like Vietnam. Then Cambodia. Then Laos, then Thailand, okay? And so we're trying to stop that. So we're going to kind of fight these proxy wars to hopefully stop the spread of communism. That's kind of the big thing. Okay, so for the Soviet Union after World War II, they just basically want the opposite. Okay, and a lot of it comes down to security. So to help them with that security, they're going to establish defensive borders, and they're going to kind of create kind of the Soviet satellite states. If we look here, if you kind of follow my cursor, we have the Soviet Union here, and what they do is they kind of build up a little defense system, and their defense system is just other countries, kind of a little stopgap between Europe and the Soviet Union. So in between, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, Romania, and Bulgaria. All these are called satellite states. They're all independent countries, but they're really controlled by the Soviet Union. Okay, so they're kind of the stopgap between, the West and the Soviet bloc East. Okay, and again, they want to do the opposite. They want to spread communism around the world. So obviously, ideologically speaking, we're going to have two very different pieces going at this. Basically, you couldn't have further ends of the spectrum. We have democracy in America over here, capitalism, and all the way on the other side of the spectrum, we have socialism, communism, and basically the opposite. Okay, so that's what we're looking at going into the Cold War, kind of setting the stage here. Now, the first thing that we kind of mentioned with our key opponents was financial aid. And that rang true here. We call this the Truman Doctrine. I'll kind of just put up all the info for you guys here. But the Truman Doctrine takes place in a country called Greece. This is where it all takes place. Greece is kind of teetering on communism or democracy. Okay, they kind of have a little mini civil war going on. And that's common at this time period with countries that don't have a lot of money. Okay, obviously, if people are desperate times call for desperate measures, and a lot of times, the more poor your country is, or the worse off it is, it makes communism kind of sound so much better. That utopia, that ideology of communism, kind of rings louder when countries are in bad spot. Just the way it's kind of been historically, especially looking back. So what we do is we basically give Greece large amounts of arms and supplies to fight off the communist guerrillas, and we also give them a significant amount of money, okay, to kind of help combat that. And what happens is it actually works. Okay, it was significant because it showed the American that the most powerful democratic country was prepared to resist the spread of communism, and it worked. So if it can work in Greece, that kind of sparks the idea, wouldn't this work everywhere else? Which leads to basically the Truman Doctrine on steroids, which is the Marshall Plan. Instead of just giving money and arms to Greece, let's give it to basically every country that needs it in Europe. So the Marshall Plan is just the Truman Doctrine on steroids. Okay, so this was a massive economic aid plan for Europe to help it recover from the damage caused by the war. Okay, so helping Europe to recover economically would provide markets for American goods, so benefiting American industry. A prosperous Europe would be better able to resist the spread, or prosperous Europe would be better able to resist the spread of communism. All right, so there's kind of two motives there. There's one that's going to help the spread of communism, right? Kind of the domino effect, try to stop that from happening. So we'll give them a lot of money, and if all the countries are good financially, they'll be less likely to turn to communism. And then part B is if we help them out, the faster they're on their feet, the faster these other countries are on their feet and established, then they can spend their money and they're going to buy from America. So it's kind of like, ooh, we'll help you out a little bit, but we kind of want you to be on your feet so you can buy from us. So kind of selfish, kind of not at the same time. That's the Marshall Plan, just the Truman Doctrine on steroids. So, to recap, Truman Doctrine, give money to Greece. It's successful, which leads us to phase 2, which is the Marshall Plan, which is give a bunch of money to all the countries in Europe to make sure they are also well established, so they A, don't go to communism, and B, they buy from America so America can prosper. So that's where we're at so far. Moving on, we have this thing called the Eisenhower Doctrine. Nothing really special here. It doesn't really come into effect for a little bit later. But basically, here's the idea behind it. It just requires Congress to yield its war-making power to the president so that the president could take immediate military action. This is more of a precaution than anything. Just making sure that if we go to the war with the Soviet Union, that we don't waste a lot of time with the red tape and bureaucracy. Basically, we can just go to war and be ready to go immediately. Because after World War II, guys, there was a lot of shakers and movers that thought, hey, let's not stop at Germany. Let's just keep going. Let's just take out the Soviet Union because we're going to have to fight them eventually. So right now, I would say, like, if you probably polled, most Americans would think we'd eventually go to war with the Soviet Union at this time. One of the things we get out of the Cold War is this thing called the Berlin Crisis. As you can see down here, after the war, Berlin is kind of split up into 4 zones. Okay, you have like a French zone, a British zone, a Soviet zone, and a American zone. And we basically, the Soviet bloc kind of holds their side hostage, and they're not allowing people to go in and out through West Berlin and East Berlin. They build the Berlin Wall there. They don't allow Americans through to give supplies. So what America has to do is we basically do this thing called the Berlin Airlift. It's where we literally just fly over their zone of the city and we just drop a bunch of supplies off. And that kind of ends the Berlin conflict right then and there. But there's some hot times. There's literally a time where we have 2 tanks, a Soviet tank and an American tank, literally, barrel to barrel, and they're stuck like that forever. So we've almost had war start between the Soviets and Americans more times than you can count during the Cold War. Okay, there's a lot of cases of like being like this close to World War III or a nuclear war, but luckily it didn't happen. All right, we get 2 different groups formed on it. We have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, basically America and all of its friends, as you can see there on all the countries popping up. And obviously the Soviet Union has to respond, so they respond with a group called the Warsaw Pact. And you can kind of see the countries there. Most of the countries are just the Soviet bloc countries or just the Soviet satellite states. We don't got to worry about MacArthur right now. Here's the things we're going to end off on. Okay, first things first. In the Cold War, competition is key. We compete over everything. First things first, nuclear weapons. It's called the arms race. Okay, the more weapons of mass destruction you have, the better off you are. So we see a giant military buildup between the Soviet Union and the Americas. And eventually we're going to see that lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union, where they're going to, both America and the Soviet Union are just going to spend on the military, and eventually the Soviet Union is going to run out of money, but they're not going to run out of money until the 1990s. All right, so the arms race becomes huge. Another big thing about competing is the space race, and the space race is what we're going to be kind of focusing on this week a little bit more with your assignments. Okay, so Cold War tensions increased in the U.S. when the USSR launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, into geocentric orbit on October 4th, 1957. So the Soviets beat us when they sent something into space before us, just a satellite, and then they kind of doubled down. So on April 12th, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space and the first to orbit Earth. This was a huge blow to American morale, like general population. Like I know, for example, I know some grandparents, they haven't read a paper since they read that Yuri Gagarin, I have a hard time with his name. Once he made it to space and that hit the newspapers, that was a huge blow to America. Now, on May 25th, 1961, so just shortly after Gagarin made it to space, Kennedy gave a speech challenging America to land a man on the moon and return him safely by the end of the decade. All right, so Kennedy gives this demand that in 10 years we need to land somebody on the moon and bring them back. And at this time, America didn't even have a rocket powerful enough to make it into orbit. But he says, nope, in 10 years you'll have that rocket and you'll be able to get someone to the moon and you'll be able to get someone back. I guarantee it. So talk about a huge pressure situation put on NASA. But the crazy thing is, 8 years later, not even a decade later, 8 years later, we have Apollo 11 landing on the moon. We have Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And they land there. They obviously, we got the pictures there. And then they came back safe and sound. Okay, that's real fast. That's the first half of the Cold War. This week, you guys will look at the space race and kind of give you some more assignments, kind of giving you the overarching themes of the Cold War. So this week, it's going to kind of be the Cold War in a big overview, and then we're just going to look at the space race. And then next week, we'll look at some other things that go with it, like the Kennedy assassination and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But for now, guys, that's all I have. I'm running out of time. Talk to you guys later.